Howard.
Superb. Thank you, Jason. Well, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us on this call. And as Jason said, my name is Howard Williams. I'm the executive pastor of Alive Church, and I function as part of the ground level team as well. So honoured to bring some thoughts today and hopefully spark a little bit of discussion amongst us. Paul Benger introduced a phrase to us a number of years ago, which is the genius is in the room. Or in this context, the genius, I suppose, is on the Zoom call in some way. And what we mean by that is, you know, that not one person holds all of the answers, but together collectively, we may find and discover some answers for various problems and various things that we are experiencing around this whole particular area. So today really is about the practical and the kind of steps we can take to returning to buildings should we have made that decision that is right for us. And I suppose there's a few things just to say as caveats over all the stuff I've prepared. The first thing is Jason's going to throw some notes in the chat for us. It's a PDF. Feel free to download it. Feel free to take it. It's just my notes from this session. If there's anything in there that's helpful to you, please take, digest, use, do whatever you want with it. There's a whole number of links at the end of the document that you might find helpful. I've certainly found them helpful in terms of where to get steer from, where to get the information to make informed decisions, etc. So we all know that church hasn't closed. We're all very active. The church is engaged wherever it is at this moment of time. But of course, our use of buildings has most definitely been paused. And for many of us, we're now considering timescales and what that can look like. It'd be interesting to know, maybe you can throw this in the chat, if you've made a decision yet about what a return to a building might look like. Be good for us just to have a reference point, because we'll use that later on. If you're still in that slightly nebulous place of it won't be until at least December, something like that, then join the boat, so are we. But some of you might have got a little bit more further down the line, or perhaps you're using buildings for certain things and not for Sunday gatherings and that sort of stuff. I mean, anything you want to put in the chat just to help with that, that would be really helpful, I think, so that people can interact later on. I think one of the early things to say in all of this is that your building and your people are unique to you. So what I can't say today is how to write your assessment of risk, because that will be very much dependent on your particular circumstances and what you want to use your building for and the nature of your building. All buildings differ. You know, it's Alive. We've got a multitude of things that we're working through, from owned buildings through to rented properties, through to buildings that really could only hold, you know, 35 in the current socially distanced world, through to buildings that could probably hold more, but we're not sure yet whether we want to approach that context of inviting wider bodies into it, etc. My starting point in all of this is that we must seek quality over quantity, and we must seek depth over simplification. I'm a big believer, and so this is my bias, I'll just name it. I'm a big believer that one of the ways that we love one another and that we love people is by having an eye on the health of those people and doing everything that we can to ensure that the spaces that we use are spaces that we have properly assessed for the health needs, spiritual, emotional, physical health needs of our people. And therefore, as you think about your people and you think about returning to using buildings, my particular bias would say that we've got to think about all of our people in our thinking. Of course, there'll be a number that have been asked to isolate. There'll have been a number that are fearful about returning to buildings. There will be a number that are absolutely chomping at the bit and want to be back in buildings 6 weeks ago, you know. So you'll have that whole scope of people. And for you as leaders or on leadership teams, we need wisdom and the Holy Spirit to guide us in our decision making. If you're anything like me, the first few weeks of lockdown were adrenaline fueled. We ran quite quickly to become masters of brand new skill sets. We all started very quickly with online things and things like that. This new set of challenges and things regarding return to building feels to me personally like a slower set of walking rather than a rushed process. And I think that's good for us in terms of what we do and how we do it. So I'm going to start just a few thoughts really. Some of you on the call perhaps haven't even begun to make the decision yet. So just a few thoughts and principles about actually how do you go around making a well-informed, biblical, Holy Spirit inspired decision about returning to a building. Not just a pragmatic, not just our people are chomping at the bit to do it, but actually, you know, listening to the voice of God in this moment of time. Well, the first thing I think is prayer. So we should be a prayerful people in this season around this particular issue. James 1 verse 5 encourages, doesn't it? You know, if we lack wisdom, to seek God, to ask for it. And I think in this particular issue, we need wisdom in abundance. So prayer, make our decision, and it's a prayerful decision. It's not a pragmatic decision first and foremost. It's a prayerful decision first and foremost. And then just a few principles that I think are helpful in making the decision. The first is the biblical principle of humility. So we humbly seek God, and what I mean by humility is name the things that are our particular bias in this particular set of processes. So for you personally, you might be chomping at the bit to be back in your building. It's good for you to name that. As I said, my bias in all of this is that I'm thinking quite strongly at the moment about the health of our people. And that is a physical health as well as an emotional and spiritual health. And I've made it my bias to do the learning and do the thinking around that rather than just pushing towards a vision of we'll be back in the building. I've done quite a bit of learning around that and my own particular bias. So that's where I would stand. So a humility to name that and to actually understand that you will have a distinct perspective and others will have a different perspective. And then it's humble to listen to those other perspectives as well. That's where humility comes in. I think it's a big principle from the Bible that we do this particular decision-making process under a canopy of love. So that everything we decide in this moment of time reveals our love for people. And our love in your context could be a different set of decisions to what it does in another context. I think one of the dangerous things would be for us just to copy one another and for us all to make a decision all at the same time. I think it has to be unique to you and to your people and your situation. But you do that primarily because we love people. Now, you might be in a context where actually you're running dry on how you can connect with people through digital realm. And you know now that actually physical spaces are important again for some level of expressing that, the love of fellowship and those sort of things to one another. And therefore you might be pushing and pressing more into opening your buildings than perhaps one or two environments that might be still doing quite well in the online space and seeing some of the fruit of that. So again, from your context, clothe all of this in love. How do we love our people? Maybe the fourth principle in terms of making that decision, from my perspective, I would say, would be the word persistence. And the reason I say that is I think we're in a marathon mindset now, not a sprint mindset. So the decisions we make at the moment have to be well thought through and well considered decisions. Whereas at the outset of all of this, none of us knew what we were really running into. None of us knew the timescales. Some of us perhaps thought, you know, this is just a few weeks, we'll be okay. But actually we're in a marathon mindset now. We've got to be in a long haul, well thought through, well considered set of principles and set of processes. The other thing just to say on that as well is that I think it's really worth us in our planning now to also understand that there may be moments of time in the imminent stroke medium term future where we'll have to return to some of our other plans. So I think it's worth saying that a revisit to buildings at this moment of time may well, in the future, as we've seen in Leicester, possibility in Peterborough in the coming days, those sort of things may well have local implications where actually we'll have to stop meeting in buildings. So don't stop all of the other work that's been taking place and throw everything into a return to building. I think that would be short-sighted at this moment of time. I think it's worth, we're using the word hybrid. I think it's worth learning what's been learnt in this season and carrying that forward as we look at approaching use of buildings as well. But persistence, long-term thinking, this is, whatever we hear out there, I think there is a long-term, and, the Bible talks about finishing the race, doesn't it? Not just coming first in the race, those kind of principles. And then the final thing from the principle of making the decision is wisdom. And where do we seek wisdom in this? Well, obviously there's biblical wisdom. There's wisdom that we seek from God in prayer. But there's also becoming aware of what the problem is, aware of the things that we're facing, do some research and do some reading, do some understanding and equip yourself at a local level with the picture as well. The national picture is really helpful for us, but it's really good for us to be forewarned at a local level as well. Understand what it's like in your town or your city. Understand the numbers, get to know the health figures, those sort of things. They're all available to us. And it's those things that can really help us understand a picture, especially if there is an outbreak of COVID in and around your region. It's helpful to have a sense of the knowledge of what is happening locally. I mean, the local picture in Peterborough at the moment is centred around a particular district or a particular road. And that's the kind of information that is beginning to emerge now. Whereas right at the beginning of this, the only thing we could deal with was a national picture. So it's helpful to know and understand, be wise with information, etc. 3 things as you go into buildings and consider 3 habits or 3 things that are perhaps precautions in all of this, or areas to be aware of. One is that we are habitual people and habits are really hard to break. So as people return to a building, there will be set in practices and ways of behaviour that you will have tried to risk assess, and you'll have tried to do all the work thinking, well, people will behave in this manner, but the likelihood is they won't. The likelihood is that a lot of people will try and hug at the very first moment they walk through the door. Those sort of things. Slightly glib example, but it's that kind of thing that you can do all of your planning and all of your thinking, but in truth, habits are fairly hard to break. I remember the very first week of the whole lockdown period, we'd done a whole set of announcements in one of our locations about health protocols during the service, and then effectively at the end of the service, everybody behaved as though it was a normal week. And therefore, all that you can do to keep communicating and keep reiterating that at a local level is helpful. Again, another precaution, you will have a vast array of opinion and voices in this, from those that are, as I said, really keen to be back, through to those that actually wouldn't even come back if you started a service this week. And there'll be a whole grouping across that spectrum of people. So for you as a leadership team, it's helpful, I think, to get an understanding of that from your people. It's helpful to understand what you're sensing in the people, a little survey or a few questions of them to understand what the church are feeling. But knowing that actually there will be a spectrum of opinion, and it's for you to seek God for what is right in your season. And then thirdly, I suppose precaution, understand that whatever plan you do, it won't go perfectly. There'll be some changes and things you'll have to tweak and change week in, week out. You'll have to learn, you'll have to adopt new practices and new principles, all of those things, because that is the season we're in. And a lot of the plans will have to adapt to the local knowledge that we have, and the national picture that we get as well. So some thoughts around there. Some maybe biblical principles, that's great, Pete, circling the questionnaire, great thinking, just to understand what's the kind of temperature of the people. It's really helpful. Here, just around making that decision, I found these 4 questions really helpful. And I'm going to share at the end of our session a little chart that you can use to plot these questions. The first one is this: is our church family and local community ready for us to reopen? So that's where your surveys and all those sort of things come into play. So are the body of people and our local community ready for the church to reopen? Maybe you've already answered that. The second one: is our facility ready to meet all the health and safety requirements? We'll come on to making your premises ready in a few minutes' time. But actually, have we got a building that can robustly cope with the health and safety requirements? And because if we haven't, that almost answers the question of whether we should return to it, etc. The third one: are our staff and volunteers adequately trained for reopening? So in other words, how have we done our training program for those people who are going to be integral at welcoming people back to our buildings? And when I say buildings, I mean rented buildings as well. It won't be strong enough that one of you holds all of this knowledge. It'll have to be a dispersed team that understand this, are trained in it, are walked through the various processes and those sort of things, in order that there's a good culture that people walk back into. And the third and the final point: are we able to monitor and adapt to changing needs or requirements? In other words, is our plan flexible enough? Because I think that's an incredibly important thing in these coming weeks if we're choosing to use buildings again. Is there flexibility in our plan, and can we action that flexibility immediately? You know, we don't want to go back to a building and then it takes us another 6 weeks to put the next plan in motion. It should be next day if we need to make it more flexible, etc. So hopefully there's some thoughts there about how to help make that decision. And some of those things perhaps you can take to leadership teams and areas that can perhaps help you. But the rest of the time really is about once the decision's made. So you've made a decision, and that decision looks like, okay, we're going to, at this date, move back towards a building. And we're just going to go really practical on some of the things that I'm thinking about, we're thinking about here, and then we'll open it up for sharing some wisdom amongst us. So once your decision's made, I think the first thing to do is form a team. When I say a team can be 2 people. Now, I do have a bias towards team-led ministry. So again, let me just name that. But I think there's real strength in bringing a few people around the planning stage. You don't have to do all of that on your own. I've seen a few emails flying around from administrators who are getting swamped in risk assessments and assessment of risks and all those sort of things at the moment. Support them, have teams around them, get people to come alongside, especially if you're doing a walk through a building and that sort of thing. You won't see every perspective. So get other people in to help you see that perspective and build a team around it. And that team, on that team, there's a couple of things I would suggest you do. We learned this right at the beginning of lockdown, but in each role, if you can, have 2 people on each role within that team. It's just really healthy from a health perspective. If one of those people does get ill, someone else can just carry it. You don't need to name them primaries and secondaries or anything like that, but just have 2 people, especially the team leads or the coordinators of that team. Super helpful, you know, should something happen. And then assign 1 person to really monitor governmental guidance, local guidance, so that those things you've just got an eye on. Get somebody who's up to speed with, you know, sitting on a government website and keeping an eye on that stuff. And I've put at the bottom of these notes some links to places that I'm finding really helpful for keeping up to speed with the latest advice. And then you want that person, or at least the coordinator of the team, to be really on it, knowing when you dial up your plan and dial down your plan. And so what I mean by that is, you know, when are you good to action getting into buildings, and when is it from a local perspective that you might need to come back from that? So dial up and dial down. So form a team. And then my second stage would be develop what I call a staged plan. Now that might sound a little bit highly faluted, but I think there's a lot of wisdom in us not just going straight in with Sunday services, but I think there's a lot of wisdom in us doing things at staged levels. So you might say in your building, okay, we'll run one of our Connect or Life or cell groups in that, and we'll build some practice for a small body of people, 10 people in the building, and we'll do the learning through that particular thing. And we'll run that for, say, 4 weeks. So we'll keep that as a bubble, protected set of people, and we'll use that moment of time. That could be part of a really good staged plan. It helps you get to know your building. It helps you get to know the various protocols that you might want to put in place. That might lead you to something else where you start to bring a team together about integrating for a September launch in your building for a Sunday, etc. But I would say develop a stage plan. And in the notes I've put a lives overview of our stage plan. We've got much more detailed stuff behind the scenes, which isn't really going to be that helpful to you. But just from an overview perspective, it's a good starter, really. And again, take it, bin it if you don't need it, etc. But I think those sort of things are helpful there. Then the next thing I think you're going to have to do once you've done your planning thing is you're going to need to write what is now called an assessment of risk. So we'd understand that as a risk assessment. The terminology now from governmental level is an assessment of risk. And Jason, I mean, is really hot on these sort of things with one event, etc. My understanding of what we're trying to do in this is to assess the risk and then do everything we can to mitigate it. So within a COVID environment, there are a whole number of risks associated with the internal spaces that we're using and the type of operation that we do in the life of the church. So you're going to have to walk through each one of those stages and think about what plans and things you can put in place to mitigate the risk in those environments. Again, in the notes, I've put 3 or 4 places that have got a great template for starting assessment of risks. There's no point reinventing the wheel if someone's done it for us. So the Baptist Union have done a brilliant one, which is a really good document, and that's in my notes. You can just link to that. The Church of England one's actually pretty good as well and pretty robust. And I've put the DFE stuff in there, with the health and safety exec stuff in there as well. You want it to be really practical. It doesn't need to be a massive document of words just for words' sake. It has to be literally pick off the shelf and adaptable for people to implement on the ground. People have to be able to understand it. They have to know who is going to action stuff, and they need to know that it is implementable. So we can get this and we can make this happen. And then the other thing I would say about our risk assessments is that risk assessments are only ever as good if you back it up with practice. So a risk assessment is no good as just a document that you put on your website. I mean, that's a big takeaway. You really need to publish your risk assessment, but you have to back it up with the practice as well. So your risk assessment should talk about what the teams are going to do and who's going to do that and who's going to lead on it. But my advice around risk assessments is start from a walk through your building and have someone else with you who is pretending to be a first-time visitor in that environment, and walk through the practice. So if normally you have someone on the front door who greets people and shakes their hand, and that's part of your culture, if you want to continue doing that, you're going to have to walk through the process of what a greeting looks like and put a risk assessment in for that particular thing. And that's how detailed I would go in your risk assessment. So that at each stage of your process with people walking into your building and through your building, where they sit, how far away from others they sit, bubbles of people, those sort of things. Again, my bias, because I'm thinking quite strongly around the healthcare of people in this particular environment, my particular bias would say it's better to go a little bit more detailed and think through each part of that than just a broad brush simplified thing. I think depth at this moment of time will save you potential hassle in the future as well. Just a few other things around that assessment of risk, a few things that the government are now saying are really strongly advisable. So they're now saying it is very advisable for churches to implement face coverings for anyone inside buildings. That came out this week. So it's not law, but it is strong advice that face coverings are used in internal buildings from a church or a place of worship perspective. So I think that's good practice for us to pick that up. And obviously the ruling really still is 2 meters. There's obviously a lot now about the 1 meter rule. My understanding of the 1 meter is the importance of the plus sign at the end of it. Okay, so 1 meter really means if you can't do 2 meters, then 1 meter with added other layers of protection is acceptable. So that would definitely mean face masks. And the government are advising us at the moment that actually within the context of a building, people still remain as much as possible in their bubble units. So there's not as much social interaction as perhaps we were used to in our church environments, etc. That would also help in the 1 meter plus. But I don't think any of us should really honestly be planning for just people to sit 1 meter apart from each other and think that that's okay. I think we should be thinking 2 meters around each bubble. If we can't do that because of space restrictions and those sort of things, we should be putting other layers into that. One of the other things that the government advises in their planning for places of worship, that everybody who enters the building should hand wash as they enter the building. So for Alive, that has a particular, certainly in one of our locations, has a particular issue for us about which entrance we use. Because if we use our normal entrance to the auditorium, the hand washing facilities are through about another 6 or 7 doorways. So ridiculous for us to use that entrance. It make a lot of sense for us to use a side entrance where immediately you can go straight to the hand washing facilities. So again, it's just thinking through those layers of complexity if you follow the guidance as it's outlined. And they particularly name hand washing rather than just use of a sanitizer. So again, for your interpretation, etc., but I'm just putting it in there. So I think it's important, think like a visitor, think like a guest, and walk through each part of your practice, etc. there. Just a word around rented properties. I know many of you are perhaps thinking about working alongside rented properties, etc. So a rented property will also be doing a risk assessment for everything that's in their building or general use of their building. Yours should supersede theirs for your own particular activities. So use their risk assessment as your general starting point, but they won't be able to cover all of your practices, all of your behaviours around services or groups. So make sure you don't shortchange your own process just by picking theirs up. I think it's really important that you have a team doing the robust work so you know locally. And a couple of other things. Check with your insurers. What do they want to see? Do they want to see your assessment of risk? The government advises to publish them on our websites, to have them available for people. But your insurers might want to see that. They might want to have a copy of that as well. Our insurers are insuring us, and it's worth checking as well, but within our public liability for any COVID outbreak, etc., all those sort of things, that's covered within our public liability. I'm pretty certain it will be in yours as well, but it's worth just asking the question of your insurers. And of course, completely aside, many of you will perhaps be aware at the moment that there is a court process going through against insurers, or asking the insurers the question against loss of earnings and loss of business and those sort of things as well, which may have good implications for us as churches as we move forward, should that go through the courts. So work with your rented properties, work with externals, so your insurance companies, ask the question. It's better to be forewarned than stumble into something later down the line. If you've got an external health and safety provider, get them involved. If you don't have one and you want any contacts, Jason's got contacts of the people we use for one event, those sort of things. Again, helpful if you want another set of eyes over your assessment of risk. It's good, I think, to get wisdom from external practices. So that's something around writing your assessment of risk. to accompany your assessment of risk, I think there is another piece of work that's really helpful, and I would call that a communication plan. I think we're all discovering in this moment of time that communication is now taking on new forms. It's having to be done in different ways. And the truth about communication is we always think we've over communicated. In truth, we probably really haven't. We probably under communicate most of the time. And I think with this one, returning to buildings and the processes that you're putting in place and what the experience is going to be for people and all of those sort of things, I don't think you can over communicate that in the run up to your first time of using the building. One of the things, if you can do it, I would suggest could be really helpful would be a video walkthrough of what the building is going to be like and what the experience is going to be like for people as they re-enter the building. And that really can help shape people's initial assessment of what it's going to be when they walk through, and can bring confidence to people. So if, for example, you've got hand sanitizers in positions, get those on a video, show people, show one of your team using them. And this is what preparation that we've done. If you've made the decision to wear face coverings, have your team wearing your face coverings and greeting one another and those sort of things. Video, if a picture tells 1,000 words, video tells 10,000, those sort of things. It's a really great medium for trying to convey. But in your communication plan, just remember as well, not everyone's on social media. Not everybody is connecting with you through your website and those sort of things at the moment, especially some of those that are perhaps isolated. You may have to call, you may have to think that through a little bit more strategically, but develop what I would call a communication plan. And don't think you're over communicating, you really won't be. You could communicate this on a daily basis in the run up to opening your building and still people would miss it or not fully understand it. And for those people that are really fearful, walk them through this gently as well. And there is another one of these sessions that Ben Stacey is doing in a week or so's time around what online might look like as we look to return to buildings. My suggestion is that we possibly will still need a kind of hybrid approach, particularly for those that can't return to buildings for a variety of reasons. They're going to need some way of feeding, etc., as we move forward. So develop a communication plan. Final couple of things from me before we open it up for a big, wide conversation. Train staff and volunteers. You can't miss that one. Don't think, great, we've got our plan, we've communicated it to the church, we're all going to be back in Sunday morning, and then Saturday night you wake up in a cold sweat going, our Connect team or our host team don't know what we're doing. Make sure all of that is robustly done before you bring people back in. Again, I don't think you can underplay how important it is to have people who are trained and well thought through in this stuff. And one of the great things about training is rather than just put an implementable plan in their hands, bring a few people in on the planning stage so that they own it right from the beginning. They get a real great sense of being part of the solution then. And they're much more, you'll have much more success in them adopting practice if they've been part of the solution in the planning. And then a few practical things I would say are really worth considering at the moment. Here's a few actions. So what these look like in your context, you can adapt for your own context, but 6 things. First would be promote healthy hygiene practices. So you see this everywhere at the moment, signs and posters that say all about hand washing, all about what to do if you cough or sneeze, those sort of things. Have that as part of your practice now. Have that as a part of an introduction to a service. Have signs around your building. So promote healthy hygiene practices. Put it on your website. Put it in the video when you're welcoming people back. Those sort of things. I saw a great thing on, instead of shaking someone's hand at the door, why not just a squirt of hand sanitizer in their hands instead? And immediately you set a principle at that beginning. You can do it in a fun way, and all those sort of things that just says, look, we're here to look after one another. We care for and we love one another. I think those sort of things are healthy, I think, and helpful. Action, especially if you own a building. If you rent a building, you're going to need to really be assured that this bit is being done for you. But intensify your cleaning, your disinfecting, and your ventilation of your buildings. It's hugely important that we don't scrimp on that sort of stuff. I mean, effectively, if you're considering running multiple services on a Sunday, you have to really think very carefully about how you clean that space between the cohort of people. Or you have to leave 72 hours really between two sets of cohorts of people. So you've got to really think through the cleaning of your building. And if you're using rented space, you need to see from them an assurance that that building is handed to you clean. I wouldn't be venturing near a building if that hadn't been assured to me, because I don't think it's again, from my bias, I don't think that's good stewardship of the health of our people. So action, promote physical distancing or social distancing as we know it in the UK. And again, the way it's going to be hard, I suppose, if you've got, or slightly harder if you've got pews, but if you've got movable chairs, you need to think about how you lay your chairs out. I know it's really practical stuff, but the way we do that stuff will promote the culture that we want, or that we're going to have for the time being in our buildings, etc. Another action, you need to limit really any sharing of communal worship materials, anything that gets held, so collection baskets, tithe baskets, Bibles, those sort of things. If you've got someone reading, microphones, massive one. Okay, so just be really careful. No two people on a day share a microphone. And then at the end of the session, microphones need cleaning, they need disinfecting, they need leaving on a side, all of that stuff. They're little things that until you start to think about it, you think, oh, crikey, we'd stumble over that. You know, someone's sharing a lectern, someone touches it, another person touches it. There's all those things that are worth thinking through, especially if you've got a shared Bible, etc. So work on that. Obviously, communion is a big thing for all of us. Processes around communion, how we do that. General principles seem to now suggest no shared bread and shared wine. Effectively single units for each person, and the wafers are perhaps slightly better than just pieces of bread that have been handled and all those sort of things beforehand, but effectively that should be placed into someone's hand rather than a whole lot of people coming and taking. There's great stuff that I've got some resources for you at the end of this that will help you plan for those sort of areas. Can't do full immersion baptism at the moment, I'm sure you know that. So all of those sort of things in terms of planning, those things at this moment of time you can't do. And of course, at the moment, we can't do any communal singing, no congregational singing in our spaces. You are allowed one person to sing from the front. You got to make a decision as to whether that's the culture you want, and all those sort of things etc. The singing thing is under review, or my understanding it's under review, and we've begun to glean that by the end of July, although that seems to be pretty close, there may be a little bit more clarity around the singing and corporate singing. But the other ones to keep an eye on, there are some government documents now about public performance that would be helpful in informing us around what that part of our services might look like. I think clarity will come, but the public performance one might get a bit more clarity than we get it before we get it for church and public worship. So a couple more practical actions. Fifth one, plan for when a staff member or congregation member becomes sick. So this is a really important one, actually. So we're encouraged to keep a register for anyone who attends a gathering of any description. And there's a couple of things in the track and trace process that are really helpful in that. So name and phone number are really helpful in the track and trace processing. And that would really help you and help the track and trace process if one of those members of that congregation gets sick. Because basically what they want to do, or what we need to be able to do, is quickly trace anybody else who was in close proximity with that person. They're suggestive that those registers should be kept for the minimum of 3 weeks. Now, of course, we get into all the GDPR stuff and all those things if that body of people haven't already given information. So think that stuff through as well. But you should be registering people for gatherings in some description, and make sure that you've got details that you can then action should you need to, if you hear that one of that person within the last 3 weeks is now sick, etc. And the same for staff, especially if on that team one of those staff gets sick, or key volunteer gets sick. And the final thing, then, maintain healthy operations. So in other words, don't let this stuff slip. I mean, there's some really good things that will come out of this, that perhaps we, along with many of the other Western world kind of things, have got a bit sloppy on. I was with someone the other day who said, when did we stop washing our hands before we went to a restaurant anyway? That kind of same principle of we're now being asked to wash our hands before we eat in a restaurant. So when in our culture did we, but it's true, isn't it? And I think there's some things that we can continue to do to keep those kind of areas high. Final 2 things. First, implement your physical space planning with some of these things. I've mentioned some of them, but physical space planning, 2 meters, obviously where 1 meter plus, remember the plus sign, where it's not possible to do 2 meters. I've mentioned face coverings. Face coverings now are strongly advised by the government. Obviously, no congregational singing. As much as possible, a touchless experience. Keep your toilets open. But you've got to really think through use of toilets. Queuing for toilets, all of those sort of things. So if you've got 30 people in a building and you've only got 1 toilet, and you've got people there for an hour or so, you may have a queue. How are you going to do that? Are you going to mark that on the floor as 2 meter queue, etc.? How do people enter and exit that toilet to maintain that the handle on the toilet is also clean? You've got sanitizer outside the toilet as well as hand washing facilities inside it. All those things are worth thinking through. And again, just plan those things. What's your signage like in your building? Get some great signage. I don't know if you're an administrator or you've had your inbox of emails absolutely bombarded with companies who are now doing signage for COVID secure places. Mine's just gone off the charts of people daily going, we can make this sign for you and this sign. You can get branded ones for yourself, which look great, but you don't need to spend that much money. But get some really clear signage that retells people how you're caring for them in this environment. Hand washing at point of entry, hand sanitizer available throughout your building, good ventilation. If you can do it, get the windows open, especially over summer. If you've got windows in your buildings, get them open, get ventilation in that space. It's really helpful. And really think through great cleaning. How are you going to do cleaning in your building? Don't think that what was before, I mean, your standards may have been amazing, but it's still worth assessing them in this moment of time. And then finally, answer those first 4 questions again. Is our church family and local community ready for us to reopen? Is our facility ready to meet all the health and safety requirements? Are our staff and volunteers adequately trained? And are we able to monitor and adapt to changing needs or requirements? And if you say yes to all of those, you've done all of that work, then I think you're pretty good on beginning to open the doors to your buildings. And that concludes my notes and some thoughts on there. So I'd love us to open it up to wisdom, questions, comments. As I say, the wisdom's in the room. Some of you will be able to answer things that others are really battling with at the moment, and I won't be. So let's go. Jason, are you still on the call? Do you want to facilitate this?
Yes, go for it. So if you've got a question, just give us a wave and then unmute yourself. Howard's done a fantastic job, so I think he's covered most things. Anyone got any thoughts, considerations? Is anyone thinking any of those things might be a particularly difficult thing for you as a church body? Yes, Dave.
Yeah, I think my question is about toilets. that you know, where you've got corridors that are less than 2 meters wide, and you've got to have a one-way system. In our centre, that would mean kind of, you know, exiting it out of a back fire door and coming back into the main building down the road. And so it is just kind of getting your head round the practicalities of those sorts of things, particularly when you've got children in the building as well.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, obviously I've mentioned nothing about, I've mentioned nothing about children in all of this. Again, just to answer that part, the government advice on children and children's care outside of education settings is really worth picking up for anything that you're thinking of doing for children's clubs. And they've just announced and put into the places of worship just this week a whole set of advice for summer clubs and those sort of things as well. So if that's in your thinking and planning, pick it all up. It's worth thinking through. Basically, in the places of worship bit, it says young children should be cared for by the parent at this stage. So it's worth, my interpretation of that is that at this stage, I don't think it's really that we're running kids' work as well as a Sunday service. I think from a live perspective, I mean, we're not considering Sunday services at the moment, but I think we wouldn't be doing kids' work or youth work until schools are fully back anyway. So just some thoughts around kids. Around toilets and the flow of people, in a similar way, in some of our buildings, we've got corridors that aren't 2 meters wide. So are there ways of having holding stations at one end of the corridor? So I was in a store the other day that had stairs to go upstairs, and they had a staff member halfway up the stairs basically saying you can now go up, and then they had someone at the top waiting, and then you can now come down. It was that kind of thinking. And you know, I'm thinking, this is only, I'm not going to name the store, but this is great practice, but maybe a bit over the top for this type of store. But I think it's those sort of things that you can think through for corridors and that sort of stuff. I mean, in reality, you've got to assess the risk and then do everything you can to mitigate that risk. So the one-way systems is a way of mitigating risk, but there are other approaches to it as well. So you are absolutely fine to, as long as you can prove in your risk assessment that this is the best methodology in your building for mitigating the risk, the reality is that your practice then will line up with that and it'll be fine.
Yeah, as well, if you're doing a one in, one out rule with your toilets anyway, just consider where you're putting the queue for that. The queue doesn't have to be in the corridor. The queue can be before the corridor, and then you're not going to have a problem with your corridor because you're only letting one person into that space at a time anyway. So you can think about things like that. But again, you've got to have that holding space somewhere, haven't you? And it may well be that some buildings just are not large enough to actually facilitate this working. Great. Anyone else got a question for us? Yes, Charlie.
Hi, can you recommend any online training, so sort of health and safety courses or specifically COVID-19 training courses, so that we're all kind of, you know, singing off the same hymn sheet, as it were?
Jason, do you want to tackle, or anybody else, tackle the just online training for health and safety stuff? Or even speak of, you know, like a Ben Crab and APIS and those.
Yeah, there is absolutely loads. So generally the ones that are kind of most reputable is IOSH is a good one, IOSSH, and you can do an IOS safety course. They have got some stuff to do with COVID on there, which is good. We work with a guy called Ben Crab, and he's quite good at pointing you in the right direction for things you need for your particular context as well. I think the bits that Howard's pointed you towards in the guidance are all quite good places to base stuff from. They won't specifically be providing training. There is also NEBOSH, but that one is a bit more intense. You're going to need to take a month out of your schedule to do that one. But it'd be well worth looking at IOSH as a good place. So they've got a whole, I'm just looking on their website now, actually, and they've got a whole section on that. So there will be some stuff that they're providing specifically for that.
We accessed some training through, it wasn't actually our local authority, but another local authority, which was more around opening community buildings, but because a lot of our churches are also community buildings, that was quite helpful because they did something really specific around that. So it might be worth looking at if your local authority have got anything which will be localised as well. That's the benefit of that.
Brilliant.
It's great, Zoe.
Any more questions?
Or any other wisdom, any other thinking that people are doing. Obviously, you know, mine will have gaps in it. So other things that people are considering, walking through, that will be helpful to us.
Yeah, I had a question around if anybody's thinking about ways in which they're going to manage the attendance to services once they're reopened. Because if your situation is like mine and our church, then we would have typically in a Sunday service up to 120 people, but our building will only safely house maybe 25 people. So how are we going to manage that? I mean, we've thought about ticketing services, but haven't really gone any further than the thinking.
Yeah. I suppose there's a number of ways. I know some churches have looked at ticketing. So are they going to ticket Sunday services? You know, almost on a first come, first serve basis. Obviously, there's whether you have kind of split your congregation into groups. So, you know, you have a different week for each different group. So, you know, this Sunday we're going to have group 1 of the congregation. This next Sunday will be group 2. Any other suggestions from you, Howard, on that one?
Oh yeah, there's a variety of things. All of them seem to have a much higher level of workload around them. So the other ones are multiple services throughout the week. I think there's a number of things worth considering in all this. And not only is it the physical health to do with COVID, but there's also the mental health and the workload health that we place upon teams and all those sort of things. And then there's the perception health. You know, if you're not in that first group and you're not there for the first 3 weeks, how does that make you feel? And those sort of things. And I think we as leaders have got to think quite strongly around the cultures that we're creating in our churches as we return to buildings. And what's the downside of segregated small groups, those sort of things. I think that's a really big conversation for leadership teams to be having. It's not, obviously today we've done a lot of the practical stuff and they're helpful if you've made the decision. But I think there are some big cultural questions for us around the why we're returning to buildings, what benefit does it have? And when we've answered that question, I think then the practical of how do we go about it will align itself with the, well, this is what we want to achieve, etc.
And it may well be that actually instead of, you know, returning to your building every week, you might even want to look at, do we do a once a month outdoor gathering, or do we do a once a month gathering in a hired space that would be large enough to facilitate everyone gathering together?
Yeah,
there are those other options on the table, but obviously then you've got to bear in mind all the other factors that go in with a rented space and then the financial implications of that as well. So
just on that, Jason, as well, I'm sure most of you will now be aware there was a little bit of confusion at the outset about the number 30 as well. So churches, places of worship are allowed to hold more than 30 people for a service, but that is all dependent on your assessment of risk and whether the building can hold them. There is no upper limit on that number now, and that is the same for your grounds as well. So there's no limit of 30, but you have to do it with your assessment of risk, okay? And you can also hold something in a public space, an outdoor public space, again with no limit of 30 on it. But again, that would need to be accompanied with an assessment of risk for that particular thing. So you could have a prayer meeting in a park, for example. There's a couple of things that the government suggests. One is that you work with a local authority on that. And the second is that it has to be risk assessed. So it can only be done if you've got the right protocols and things in place. You can't just say, right, Saturday, we're all going down the park for a prayer meeting. Yeah, no, that's but maybe a bit of clarity around numbers is helpful to us all.
Mark.
Yeah, just a quick thought. I was in a meeting this lunchtime with some local churches, and one of the local churches ran their first service on Sunday. So they did a gathered service, the Salvation Army, and they really enjoyed it. They met 2 lots of 45 minutes with a 45-minute cleaning team in between. I think they had about 70 to 80 people, to 40 people in each service. They did the social distancing with tables, which was quite an interesting one, because that then actually, by having one of the long go-pack tables, you can distance people, but they can feel connected. So people don't feel isolated, which is one of the things they recommended. They spent a month getting people back in the building through use of private prayer spaces and so on. I think as we slowly opened our building for some small group gatherings, don't underestimate the emotional turmoil that as people walk back into a building that they haven't been in for 4 or 5 months. You may have been in and out a bit more. Well, you'll have people who've not been in a building for 4 or 5 months. And I know we say the church isn't the building, but actually there's a lot tied into a space. And the outpouring of emotions as people walk back in and they suddenly realize how much they're connected to the church and the space as well. So by opening it up for people to come in and almost dip their toe in for 15 minutes and then walk out I think was really beneficial as well.
Great.
That's excellent, Mark. Thank you.
I think we've got time for one more question, if there is any more. No, great. Well, I've got one other thing I was going to share with you, which is just some guidance on broadcasting, which I'll put into the chat. So obviously, if you are using your building to record worship now or to live stream, obviously you've still got a responsibility to make that safe. And this is just a really helpful guide on that as well. I think sometimes we put all of our attention on the big public gathering, and sometimes we forget that, we've got 10 people sat in the church at the moment, all still touching things and recording things. So there's just some really helpful guidance on managing that as well.
Jason, did those 3 additional attachments that I gave you, have they gone in the chat as well?
Put those in now for you, Howard.
Thank you. Alongside the one that Jason just put in there are 3 brilliant, they're American, so they just need a bit of tempering, but they're brilliant. At the outset of lockdown, I discovered an organisation called the Humanitarian Research Group, something like that, who are the only Christian faith-based humanitarian relief agency that work into places that obviously need immediate response. And they did a brilliant piece of work for lockdown. And therefore, I picked up what I think is brilliant as well for returning to buildings. And they, in my notes, is their website, but I've downloaded the actual documents for you as well. They've got 3 documents there, which I think are pure gold, worth having as your kind of go-tos around this. One is a manual, the second is a checklist, and the third asks those 4 questions that I've just borrowed them from there, really. Those 4 questions that I said at the beginning and then at the end, use these 4 questions to assess whether it's right to go back into buildings. And they've got that with a grid and various things to open up those particular questions for greater greater wisdom. So if they go into the chat as well, you should be able to just download those from the chat. If not, Jason, I'm sure will be able to see who's on the call. And if you want those, feel free to contact Jason. He'll send those out. As I say, they are available on that particular website that is in my notes as well. It's called reopeningthechurch.com. And that's an excellent website. As I say, American-based, but much of it would feel very European as well.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Howard. Shall we have a Zoom round of applause for Howard?
Thank you.
And thank you very much, everyone, for joining us for our Wednesday Wisdom. We'll record this and put it on YouTube, so if you want to catch up on anything, you can do. And thanks very much for joining us, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Jay.
Thanks very much.